Hello, everyone. This is your Tiny Desk presentation for week 2. Hello, nonverbal communication class. We are going to talk about appearance today and all the intricate things that we need to understand about this. I'm going to use a few different theories. I actually want to talk about coordinated management of meaning. I want to talk about coordinated management meaning. I want to talk about low context and high context, the difference between ambiguous and abstract, those two different terms. And we want to talk about stereotypes, the halo effect, and other biases that influence how we are interacting with others. And we also want to look at self-fulfilling prophecy. Wow, there's a lot to do today. So let's get going. In no particular order, so we'll just jump around till we get it right. Let's start with this idea of ambiguous and abstract to start with. So if I say nonverbal communication is ambiguous, what I mean by that is that it has multiple meanings and it can be interpreted differently by all sorts of people. So it really just depends on the context of the situation and the relationship dimension. And context is, of course, the situation itself or the environment. And we'll have a whole week just on environment. Uh, but when we use the word context to talk about environment and the situation, those things, even though they're different, they also are overlapping and intertwined with each other. They're like a basket woven together. And we want to start thinking about how relationships influence how we communicate in certain situations. It influences our choices, but it influences how we're listening as well. Just think if you were ever in a conversation with someone who didn't have a lot of credibility for you, how did you listen? Or as opposed to if there was someone who had much more significance in your life and you had high thoughts about them, they were good character, trustworthy. How did you listen to that person? So that's kind of that relationship dimension, to be aware of how the other is influencing how you listen and how you pay attention to the other person. When we are in this class, we need to diagnose all these little things and all these theories about how we interpret meaning. And that's really like how we are coding messages and how we decoded messages, which we talked a lot about in class on week 1. So ambiguous means it can be open to interpretation. That means that, let's say, uh, well, if I put my hand up, if I raised my hand up, that's that's an ambiguous nonverbal gesture, because why am I putting my hand up? If if I'm on Broadway Street in New York City, standing on the corner looking out on traffic with my hand up, it could mean that I'm trying to get a taxi and hail a cab. But if I'm in the classroom as a student and I raise my hand up, that means something completely different. So that's what I mean by ambiguous. So let's start using that word. When we say, oh, I saw this nonverbal, and it was ambiguous. I didn't understand what the meaning of it was, right? And then go through the cognitive complexity of trying to find many different interpretations for that to attach to that behavior. When we say abstract, right? So there's a difference between ambiguous and abstract. In abstract, this means it's like an umbrella. It has a general meaning, but it could have many different things that it could mean, but it's all under the same general meaning. So if let's see, I'm trying to think of Well, okay, I'll just use this linguistic example because I'm having trouble thinking of a nonverbal example right now. But just to demonstrate the difference with abstract, if I say, my sister is so considerate, she is considerate, that would have a very an abstract meaning. But how is she considerate? What is her behavior? What does she do? Everyone might have a different idea of what it means to be considerate. Does she call me on my birthday? Does she call me once a week and ask how I am? Does my sister send me a gift? Or when my sister travels, she always brings back a gift for me. That's very considerate, right? Like it's just could go on and on and on. Even though we might have a general understanding of what something is, it's open to interpretation. And that means there's a high context message being delivered in the nonverbal. And we might have a general idea of understanding it, but we don't may not know specifically or have it, it might not be concrete in what it is. Uh, Cultures that are very high context, they will have much more concrete meaning attached to nonverbals. For example, there are some cultures where you are offered a beverage when you first come in, and then you're going to be offered a beverage like a cup of tea. Let's say they give you a cup of tea. The first time they give you a cup of tea, that means, and these are usually very small teacups, uh, that might have a very explicit meaning that says, thank you for visiting. But if they offer you a second cup of tea, that might have that will be connected to a very explicit message. For example, uh, I'm enjoying this visit. I consider you a friend. But if you stay long enough and they offer you the third cup of tea, and now that will have a very, in that high context culture, that will have a very explicit meaning of we are family or you are welcome to visit again. And that is something that, unless you're in that culture, and you grew up in that culture or enculturated, there's no way to know the interpretation of that. And for anyone out there who's done international travel or has worked with people from different cultures who gave them the inside scoop on what to expect and what things mean, there's those things are very implicit to a group. When we're talking about a high context culture and a low context culture, those come from Edward T. Hall. I actually have a couple of Edward T. Hall's books right here. Edward T. Hall is considered an anthropologist who really did a lot of research and work on what was happening non-verbally. So his approach is through anthropology, and he looks specifically at nonverbals. I don't have his third book here, The Hidden Door, where he just talks a lot about the way doors are used from culture to culture and the different meanings of a culture that leaves doors open versus a culture that leaves doors closed. And those have certain decoded interpretations. If you someone who's an international negotiator is going to start being much more have a much different level of expertise of understanding the difference in the subtleties of even the way a door is left open or if it's closed and how that could damage the trust of the negotiation if we're looking at intercultural encounters. I had a teacher that I worked with who had grown up in other parts of the world, and we were teaching at the same time, and we decided to blend our classes into one activity to work together. And I noticed I kept leaving all the doors open as I was going from classroom to classroom, and every time she came in and out of the classrooms, she would close the door. And I was like, oh, this is that thing that Edward T. Hall talked about. The difference. I point since she was a communication teacher and uh really good at what she did. I mentioned it to her and she was pretty excited that we had this that I noticed this difference in the way that we were using the doors between our two classrooms. So that's kind of fun when you can start noticing and decoding these things that are kind of invisible. It's like invisibility things. It's like you can kind of put on this special nonverbal communication lens and see the world a little differently. All right. So we have talked about abstract and ambiguous communication, and we're talking about high context culture and low context culture as defined by Edward T. Hall. So, a low context culture is a culture that really is much more verbal. They are much more explicit, meaning that what low context says is exactly what they mean, and they don't mean anything else. So, my mom is much more high context than I am. So, we often run into this just this thing like I'll say something like exactly what I mean. Like, I'll say something like, oh, I'm going to lunch with my friend, Kimberly. And my mom will be like, what do you mean? What are you saying? And I'm like, I'm saying I'm going to lunch with my friend. And she's like, oh, okay. Well, she perception checked, so we're going to give my mom credit for at least doing the perception check. But she does ask me often, what do I mean by that? And that's a signal that someone who's used to that iceberg way of messages being delivered, that there's the thing that's being said or not said up here, and then all the meaning that comes with it. High context culture often gets they usually have to they roll back a little and they are unsure of what's happening in low context cultures because everything is so explicit, but then they're not sure if it means something else. So sometimes the intercultural experience of being low context and high context can have its own stress piece to it when you're depending on which culture you is the dominant culture. Okay, so we talked a little bit about low context and high context. Let's now move into identity and identity management, because when we talk about identity appearances, we're talking about identity management. And I'm going to talk a bit about Goffman. I have two more books here, uh, Interaction Ritual and The Preservation of Self in Everyday Life, Goffman. And Goffman is really talking about identity management as what are the explicit things we're doing that we know we can do, either with intention, to influence how people perceive us. So that means there's this element of performance to identity that Goffman identifies. And when we talk about a performance of identity, it means that I am audience centered. I'm thinking about how other people see me, and now I will make choices, and it can be the language, the vocabulary I'm using in my language, uh, or it can be the clothes that I choose to wear. It can be jewelry that I choose to wear, how I do my hair, other things, and setting. Setting is the last one, meaning the locations that I hang out or the locations I reference that influence who I am and my identity. So because it has this performance element, Goffman uses things like instead of clothing, he'll say, what is your costume? My language or the words that I use or how I greet people now become my script, and each context or relationship might have different scripts. So, for example, I know that when I'm hanging out with my friends, I have some really good friends that I've known for over 20 years. Some of them I've known since high school, and I have very different scripts that I use with my friends than I use with my family, meaning my parents or when my grandparents were alive, or then I have a different script that I use with my children. As a parent, I use a very different type of script. That doesn't mean that I'm it basically means that I'm audience centered and I'm adapting myself and being appropriate to those relationships and the context of the situation. So what, so this is sometimes why some people have to wear a uniform at work and they have certain jargon that goes with their job. And then when they come home, they're just like, God, I got to get out of this uniform and I don't want to talk about work anymore, because sometimes we don't feel like we converge. Our identity is in alignment with the careers that demand a very specific presentation, performance. And then when we get home, we're like, I just want to be myself. I want to go back to my script. I want to go back to what I feel most comfortable wearing, not the clothes of my workplace. I don't I don't have the same formality as a teacher in the university system currently, where I definitely have things I like to wear to work. And when I get home, because I want to feel like I put work away, there are certain clothes that I wear for work that I don't wear anywhere else, so that I can, and so I do that as almost like a mental health choice of not wanting to be burned out on my work identity and remembering that who I am with my family and friends as a separate feeling. And so I make some changes to my script or to my clothing, uh, or choices. So that's something that some people do, even though I don't have like a formal uniform that I have to wear. These are things. And in fact, let's talk about my setting, because setting is a part of identity. What are the places you hang out in? You can think about different coffee shops or a gym that you might like and you don't like this other coffee shop, or you don't like this other gym, or what grocery store do you go to? These things also influence identity as well. And what car you drive, what transportation do you use? Those things are nonverbals that also influence identity. And in setting, we consider music, or the sound that is playing. And it's also sometimes why there is roommate conflicts. If someone feels like the public spaces need to be shared public spaces, but it's dominated by one type of identity or look, and they want to invite someone over, they'll be like, no, you can't play this music when my so and so's visiting, because they're feeling a mismatch, a divergence in their identity to the space. So people also make up setting, who you hang out with, right? Who you hang out with also makes it up. This is why parents are like, where are you going? Who are you going to be with? How are you getting there, right? There's sometimes some concern about people because of the way our association, our social network also makes up our identity. You might actually have a friend someone you really like, but you don't like the people they hang out with. And then by the affiliation of that person with those people, you might be nervous that's affecting your identity and you kind of distance yourself. Like, oh, go hang out with your friends, but I'm not going to hang out with you and your friends, kind of thing. Sometimes we have conflicts around these things. So we have our appearance. We have our language. Okay, I was going to talk about language. So language is not just necessarily like national languages like English and French and Spanish and Japanese and Chinese and Arabic and Hebrew. Like these are all different languages. Uh, I'm talking about even if you share the same language, you can still have coded words you use that reveal your identity, either your age group. I bet you can come up with some great examples of vocabulary choices that people in different generational groups will refer to objects differently because of the way that they grew up versus more youthful or whoever's the most current younger generation might have different ways that they refer to objects. It can also be by region. Of course, the classic example is the Coke. Is it a Coke or a soda or a pop or right? Coke, soda, or pop, which in those words can actually be interchangeable depending on the region or your global location. Some people will say, I would like a Coke. And they'll say, oh, which one? And you'll say, I'd like a 7-Up. And you're like, if you're from a culture that you only say Coke if you mean a Coca-Cola and not any of the other types of sodas, or if you, that can be really jarring to know that some people use the word Coke that way. So there's Coke, soda, or pop. But I bet you can think of other ones. When I had classrooms and we dive into this part, this is one of my favorite points of discussion to ask you, get into the vocabulary, the fun of vocabulary that reveals identity. Let me get some water here. Okay. So we talked about identity management, which has language, appearance, and setting, and mannerisms are also part of that. These are the gestures that we use that are particular to a different gender groups or different regional groups that so there's also mannerisms that can be used. This is often why social media or our mass media environment soup that we're in right now, things are spread way faster than they used to be because groups often are segregated and marginalized. The mannerisms of those groups or the language distinctions were much more isolated. But now, because of social media, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, and all the other ones, there's so many, that those things spread much faster outside of the group. And often some groups who really relied on the safety of their their mannerisms or language choices or cultural behaviors often feel like there's cultural appropriation happening because of the way that their specific expressions get used by broader culture and out of the context of how they first showed up. And that can often cause some conflicts as well. So that's a good thing to segue into coordinated management of meaning, which is part of identity management. So coordinated management of meaning is how we negotiate meaning, how we decide something means what it means. And some things are so enculturated that we don't say them out loud anymore. We just know what it means. If you are part of that culture, you already know how to interpret it. This is why kids often get a lot more explicit information, or they ask a lot of questions as they are decoding their environment. A good example of this would be like a wedding ring, on the left hand on the ring finger, having a ring on there can be it's a coordinated management meaning if the person who sees that interprets it the same way that you intended for it to be interpreted, which isn't always the case, even when you're in the same culture. So perception checking is always a good idea. If we are in a line if we say we want our identity to line up either with the other person or with a certain group of people, that's called convergence. I'm going to converge my identity to belong. So I might actually I'm going to look over. I want to be a part of that group right there. What are they doing? Oh, I see that most of them are dressed with this brand. And I see that they have this type of hairstyle or this type of jewelry, and I want to belong. I'm going to start looking for those things and then make those choices for my own identity so I can start converging my affiliation that I belong with that group. And sometimes that's because of professional, maybe we've always wanted to work for this company and we've always wanted to have this, we've always wanted to be on this sports team. So we affiliate our identity in lots of ways. And marketers and branding know we like to belong. I want to belong. I want social acceptance. So what should I do? Oh, I'm going to buy the jersey of my favorite player, and I'm going to have my hat with a brand on it, or a jacket that is worn by my favorite singer, these type of things, to affiliate, to show I belong, right? Uh, and and we will do these things to our appearance, but then of course, like, do you really belong? Do you know all the lyrics? If I say this lyrics, do you know which song it is from? Huh? 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 Or are you just a poser? You're just pretending, right? So we are trying to often affiliate ourselves and line up with a certain group so that we can have social acceptance, so we can belong. It is an essential need, belonging. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's the third one, is belonging. It's vital. It's right after sleep, right? You need oxygen, food, and water. Then you need to feel safe and have a good night's sleep. And the third thing is I need to belong. At the same time that we are trying to belong, we are also trying to not belong. And we know which groups others often affiliate us with. And the damaging, sometimes there's groups that we don't want to belong to. I don't want to be affiliated with this group over here. And so I'm going to diverge. And that's what divergence is when I'm going to make different choices than that group to make sure people know I don't belong to that group. And we do this, of course, verbally, but non-verbally. I'd be curious what examples you can come up with of the way that people might diverge their appearance, their mannerisms, their vocabulary choices, the setting, to make sure people know I don't belong with that group. There's a myriad of reasons of why that might happen. This is really, really difficult. I just want to do a shout out to blended families. Blended families are really navigating this in the safety of your own home. Kids don't have a lot of choices about what's happening with the culture of their home. And when there's a blended family, they might feel this coordinated management of meaning is turned upside down for them. And we could talk about food. We can talk about different nonverbal traditions that happen with holidays or with birthdays, that children often can't articulate a need of affiliation or of convergence. And so in their resistance, or feeling the injury or anger, they will often diverge their behavior, uh, and to show they don't belong. And unfortunately, we see parents who are not able to interpret that, or they're doing their own identity management, and it becomes almost like a competitive suffering of divergence. And then we have kind of a breakdown of trust in the home. So a shout out to blended families that are navigating so much out there. All right, let's talk about stereotypes. Yay, stereotypes. Woo. All right, stereotypes, what are they? How do we try not to do that? We got a lot of questions about them. So let's just talk about what a stereotype is to start. A stereotype is where there's a group of people and where someone who's not affiliated with that group, someone from the outside looking in, draws a line around a group and says that is a group of people. And this can be based on all sorts of things: race, gender, age, sexuality, ability, nationality, whatever it is. Like, I mean, we're talking about all sorts of ways. There is this kind of tribalism in how we distinguish our group, we, them. We're going to distinguish us from them. And so we're going to draw a line around it. And how we draw those lines will create labels that we'll put on that group based on patterns we've seen or other things that we've decided about that group, which are usually, those labels are usually created and made by people who aren't even in the group. For example, if we just we'll go back to that Republican and Democrats, where you have Republicans and Democrats, that the Republicans have all these stereotypes about Democrats, and Democrats have all these stereotypes about Republicans. But when you're in the group, you know that it's much more complex than the stereotype labels that we throw on those political groups. It's much more nuanced. And there's many subgroups that are making up that bigger group. But when you're on the outside, we have a tendency to want to glomp them all together and take this kind of shortcut for people's identity. Sometimes a group will adopt a stereotype as a kind of a way to combat the feeling of being labeled or marginalized. And it's a way to signal pride in my group, and they might actually adopt some of that's and amplify a stereotype in order to show their affiliation with that group. When stereotypes become extremely dehumanizing, it's when we're really I mean, all parts of it are dehumanizing, but let's say we're going to use an example here. We take one person out of that group, and this outsider is interacting with one person, just one, and they go, I know this person belongs to that group. What do I remember about that group? I remember A, B, and C. Okay, I'm going to take those labels. And now no matter what this person does, I'm just going to associate those labels with that person. And I will do the interaction. I will base whether their credibility or whether I trust them based on those labels. Instead of interacting with that person as their own person and decategorizing them. That's the process we want to do. We want to, when we're in an interaction, the resistance to the stereotype is really decategorizing and unaffiliating them with a group and just basing your interaction with that person based on your interactions with that person, your own interaction. And that is really important piece to kind of understand how are we avoiding those shortcuts. It means you have to slow down. It means you have to really listen. You have to do perception checking, and you also have to accept how someone presents themselves and as an individual, not just go to the category labels. I also put on here this idea of the halo effect, which the halo effect is a, a stereotype as well. We actually would call it a bias. So a halo effect is when a culture decides certain traits are attractive, and sometimes they're very evolutionary based. And our anthropologists and sociologists can help us dive into the deep meanings of some uh, ways that we affiliate attractiveness. And then some of them are socially constructed and fabricated ideas of attractiveness and what it means to be attractive. Now, halo effect is when we're interacting with someone who fits one of these social constructions, and we immediately assume because someone is good looking, they're also a good person. That's all halo effect is. Uh, they're good, they're attractive, so they must be good. And again, this is a type of stereotype, but it's more than that. It's different because of the bias, meaning there's this kind of in, invisible thing that starts happening to attractive people in the culture. And there's a lot of research about studying people who line up with these kind of social conventions of attractiveness. And then we look at their career projections, their salaries, their economic stability. And we do know that the more people are affiliated with these social constructions of attractiveness, that they have other elements of their life that uh, give them more privilege. Now, in our stories that we like to tell, we lots of our murder mysteries or other types of stories, we create anti-heroes that are very, very attractive actors playing these anti-heroes who have very problematic behaviors. I bet we can think of some. I mean, Dexter, the Showtime series Dexter really plays around with that actor being very attractive, but he's a serial killer. But we don't have to just go to serial killers. We could look at a show like Mad Men with Don Draper, who is this kind of very attractive man with a lot of sexual encounters in the show, but and he is also very unethical in his professional life and in his private life. And uh, the so he's not very good person. He's an anti-hero. So that's kind of I bet you can think of some examples as well from some of your favorite TV shows. If you really start tuning in to the halo effect as a bias, you see that our TV shows often play around with this bias and like to flip it on us. The other thing I have listed here is olfactics and smell and pheromones. I think I'm going to save and talk about that in the class next week. I think smell is really interesting, and there's a lot of incredible research coming out about smell. And a lot of things, I'll just say here that smell is really attached to emotions. And we're talking about nonverbal communication, and we have a lot of it can smell is about attractiveness and libido. It's also connected to fear and sadness. And there's other things about the way that we will connect smell to trust and feeling safe. There's some really interesting things. And actually, your sense of smell is probably better than you think it is. I was just watching the Huberman Lab on smell, which you could probably go into YouTube and look that up. Sorry if I'm pronouncing Huberman's name wrong, Huberman. Uh, he's one of my favorite health podcasts, and he has one about smell, and the research is interesting. One of the things in the interview that our expert said is people who've lost their sense of smell when they often might have happened when they had an injury. So you could have an injury not just to the front of your head, but to the back of your head as well. Because as he explains, the brain is just basically in this sloshy liquid contained in your skull. And when you have an injury, where the brain slams back and then forward, it could disconnect some of those uh, connections to our ability to smell. We also can smell through our mouth, which is how we taste as well. It doesn't just mean through the nose, but because our mouth is interconnected. So there's just some of the physiological interesting things about smell. So I'll talk about more of that in class. Let's talk about self-fulfilling prophecy. Self-fulfilling prophecy is when we have expectations about others or ourselves that is so powerful that it influences our behavior and how we decide to show up and communicate and the conversation and our nonverbals. And the self-fulfilling prophecy is that the expectation is influencing our behavior to the point where it makes the outcome exactly as we predicted. I knew it. I knew that was going to happen. I knew it all along. And this can be other imposed. So we could be ourselves, just ourselves. But if someone always is coming at us and treating us a certain way and not really listening or interpret or willing to perception check and be influenced by who we are in the dialogue, they just made up their mind about us. The problem is that over time we start to, because we do mirroring so well as people, that we start matching the expectation and then it becomes true. And this can be very unconscious that this is happening. And sometimes we are in interactions with bad actors or people with really dark personality types that are interacting in a way that force us into acting out certain things, even though we try to resist as much as possible. um, and this can be negative. I'm kind of talking like it's a negative thing, but we could do it in a positive way. If we have a mentor who really believes in us, but our self-confidence is low, but they come at us all the time, like, you can do it. Here, let's figure this out. We all make mistakes. We can move on from that one. Let's bounce and move on to the next thing. Whatever it is, we could have a positive mirroring as well, if we have a really good mentor or someone in our corner. Okay, those are the things I'm going to talk about. I hope this helped. I'm going to sign off because I think it's already been too long, but I hope this helped you with this week's information.